Thank you so much. I was very honored to be asked to come and participate with you today because I've known that this event has been gathering steam, and also it was the place where the conversation was taking place in my state, the same conversation that I know some of you are active in other parts of the country. There's something happening now. It's not just that Congress has given us something to talk about in the last month or so, but something is happening in the country, and this conversation about access to food, whether it's in song and movies like you saw last night, or in meetings or conversations, something's going on. And I'm thrilled to be part of that because it's been central to my life. When I say it's been central to my life, it goes back a long ways. My father was a Marine in the Second World War, stationed in China. After the war, he brought home little tiny pictures. You remember those old cameras? Some of you don't, some of you do. Of people dying in front of him from hunger and malnutrition. He came home. His generation thought of science and technology as an approach. He became an animal disease specialist and a researcher, electron microscopist for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And we moved around the country as USDA built new research facilities to tackle the question of world hunger and animal and crop agriculture. And my church and my community reinforced that at every step of the way. And I actually went off to college in the same biochemistry and at one point then became part of my church's domestic sort of Peace Corps program, working on food cooperatives and farm worker cooperatives in California. And in that experience, I had a lot of opportunity to feel the different parts of the passion when the question of food and hunger comes up. For my dad, it was something that he had seen. For my own work, I had worked for a while for Cooperative Extension and what we used to call the FNEP program. I know some of you are that old, but it was Emergency Food and Nutrition Education Program. It was about educating young people, especially in urban areas at that time, around food and nutrition issues. Might sound familiar, but it was 40 years ago. But in that process of doing that work in California, every time I thought we were on the brink of something happening where we would begin to make a change, I was also working with some farms that were connected to the urban food clubs and food cooperatives, something would happen in the policy arena that would take the legs out completely from what folks were doing. And it began to dawn on me that I needed to be smarter about what the policies were that were making the future. And luckily, a number of farmers from up in the region of California, sort of near Arbuckle, kind of by Sacramento, in that area, really sat me down and gave me a very long and very detailed history and background on where our policies had come from and what had happened to them. And certainly as a nation, that policy interaction has been critical even to how we make and how we have constructed the nation. Some of you know our history going back, tens of thousands of years, but, folks left the Siberian Peninsula and came this way looking for food and for more food security. There are plenty of incredibly well-written books about Jamestown, one of the earliest colonies, and the fact that the international market for tobacco became so lucrative, people stopped growing food crops, and by the time the King of England took control of that corporation and sent over a governor, he had to tell people to tear up their tobacco crops and plant food because they were literally starving. In fact, there was a whole period called the starving period. And it also was critical to the beginning of very bad relations between those colonists and the indigenous people, the Powhatans who were there, because they, who had been so generous when the English arrived, became to be seen by the colonists as a place to go steal corn or other food supplies or to take over their hunting grounds. And there began to be conflict. We know that conflict right here in our own state. It's the 150th anniversary of our conflict, the U.S.-Dakota War, where Dakota people and others who had given up their hunting lands for the promise of food delivered every year suddenly found that the food didn't show up. What a surprise, huh? What a shock. And in the end, it led us to one of the most catastrophic, the most violent, and for everybody, the most negative consequential war, the U.S.-Dakota War, that we're still suffering from today. I think we're tackling that directly, but food was at the center of it. And some of you know the one person, one of the traders who had been very dishonest, said that the Indians could just eat grass if they were hungry. And he was murdered, and his body was left with grass in his mouth. So the power of that violence linked to the question of food and food security, linked to the question of policy and to land, was clearly at the heart of even the founding of this state. But really, it was in the last century that we began to think about policy as a way to tackle this more directly. In the late 1800s, there were all kinds of booms and busts. We used to call them panics. In the 1930s, we started calling these things depressions, and I think more recently we've used words like the Great Recession. But in the 1880s and 1890s, these were called panics because people were panicked. They were starving because the economic forces were turning them upside down. Especially in our region, in this greater and upper Midwestern region, everybody came together and they began to look for those solutions that had to do with coming together. That coming together was in two ways. One was in what we call today the cooperative movement, but it was the place where people, especially rural community residents and farmers, said we have to economically cooperate, whether it was to build an infrastructure or to market crops or to deal with the monopolies who sold or bought. How do you break that down? But they also came together in political parties, whether it was the Farmer Labor Party or the Nonpartisan League in North Dakota. In North Dakota, the Nonpartisan League became so important and took control politically, and in that process then created a state-owned bank to provide fair credit opportunities for the food producers and those who lived in small towns. A state-owned grain elevator, because many of the monopoly grain dealers and grain elevators were dishonest in their dealing with it. And they have an opportunity in North Dakota today to build their economy inside out because those institutions were created. But that notion of people coming together to tackle the economic crisis that they called panics was something that was on people's minds at the end of the First World War. There was a big crisis right before the First World War, especially in our part of the country. Hunger was everywhere. The First World War created a kind of sudden market, whether it was for steel or iron taken out of our iron mines or for food. The whole world, in a sense, was involved in the war. The U.S. was very late coming into the war, but we were the suppliers. But after that First World War, we had the collapse. And in that collapse, people began discussing policies, especially at the state and federal levels, that could do something about these cyclical economic crises that led to poverty, hunger, malnourishment, and in many instances, to death or diseases that would disable people for the rest of their lives. There were a couple instances where those policies were actually passed by Congress, but they got vetoed. And in some of the veto messages, they were quite bold in saying, hey, we can't have this policy because that would make farmers able to get a better price. That would mean that our industrialists would have to pay their workers more, and that would make our exports less competitive. This was in the early 1900s. Sound familiar? They have like a loop tape. They just run this loop tape, But in that process, we took ourselves into a national crisis, what we call the Great Depression. It started in the Midwest and in rural parts of the country much earlier in the 20s, and by the 30s and 31 in particular, they began to notice it in the cities. And of course, that led to the election where Franklin Roosevelt was elected, and he began to tackle deeply and comprehensively those parts of the policy that he could see were adding to the national crisis when 1/3 of the nation was unemployed, and that third was on the brink of disaster every day, day in and day out. Today, we have 50 million. That's about 1/6. We're a little better off than in the Great Depression. I wouldn't call that great. We got half our kids, going to have food insecurity or be hungry at some point, so maybe that was even more than in the 30s. But in any case, Roosevelt did it the right way. He tackled the problem of jobs. He tackled the problem of wages and what was the payment that people received for their work, and supported collective bargaining and other issues. He tackled the question of seniors, which was one of the most dramatic part with Social Security, but he tackled fundamentally the mechanisms of crisis, and he was reinforced by some of the economic theories of the time. Europeans had faced these same problems. People like Lord Keynes and others talked about new ways of approaching policy. Keynesian became a kind of word at the time. But for Europe, they could see that that crisis unaddressed led them to governments of intolerance and horror like the Nazis, like the fascist governments that sprung up in so many countries in Europe coming out of their depression. And I think Roosevelt and others saw that we had to have ways of addressing the crisis of hunger, unemployment, malnourishment here, and we had to do it directly. But that was a kind of golden era for tackling our problems. It was a time the nation came together, and then on top of that, the global war, the World War. 1 in every 10 or 12 of us was in the military. Every family was affected. Everybody was together going after the process of protecting the planet from being overrun by Hitler and the Nazis. But in that period, we also began to see the pushback. Those who were not happy with some of the things that had come out of that Great Depression era, the New Deal. You began seeing writing about New Deal policies where they were called Bolshevik, or you began to see those who had been very happy with the relations and particularly relations between tenant farmers and the landowners in the South and the cotton plantations. You began to see those whose power had been changed or had lessened in the course of those policy changes beginning to push back. In the 1950s, you hear all of this talk about we've got to go back to the free market, this is Bolshevik, this is socialist, and a tremendous pushback when we had, as a nation, settled and solved many of our most important and most complex economic and social problems. The pushback began, and in the early 1970s, we essentially abandoned what we had done in agricultural policy and food and hunger policy from the earlier era, and this began a new push. Yes, we had back and forth, the creation of our food stamp program, or SNAP now, with the creation of some of our school lunch programs and the WIC program. But we began to see that the policy stopped being about addressing directly the economic circumstances that people find themselves in, and became to be much more about, well, can we kind of soften the edges? Can we provide charity? Can the churches provide charity? I went to college in 1968, so that tells you a little bit about how old I am. And in that year, I was revved up, and I was taking a lot of courses in development. We had funny words for it then, but I was in an international development class about fixing the poor people in the third world. 1968. There were a lot of things going on in 1968. And in my textbook, which I actually have here if anyone really is interested, there were whole sections on how, the problem is really in people's minds, and we have to lessen the power of religion because that's holding back people from being modern. And at small towns, of course, I was from a small town. Small towns are very negative because they keep you from being impersonal in your relationships, and so you're not as committed to economic development. And there's a whole chapter that says when you go off to Sudan or wherever you might go off to under the auspices of whoever you go off with, you got to ruin those villages and get rid of them. You got to weaken the power of religion. I mean, it was very clear ideology. We're not quite that bold or outrageous, perhaps, but it is still in the mindset. Even today, we have the mindset, particularly around the notion that charity is kind of the solution, and one of the problems with that, of course, is that it doesn't work. I mean, I think the movie did an excellent job of just saying, but it also makes us think this policy direction is going to do something, so that's like, confusing. And it makes us think that in some way we're going to be taking care of this by pursuing some direction like greater tax write-offs or something like that. But the notion at the bottom is that policy really matters. And a few years ago, I worked at the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, and I'd worked at USDA before. And I really focused on learning about where does the policy intervene and intersect. And I was working especially in the international, because trade policy began to be the place where these policies were being designed. We would do something good like in Minnesota, and somebody would run off to Washington and try to overturn it. Or we'd do something good in Congress, like the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act. And somebody run off to Geneva and try to overturn that in trade negotiations. And I put a lot of time in my life into that, and at the same time began to understand how other things in the global arena, like what we did with the infant formula work, what was called at that time the Nestle boycott. But at some point in that process, I began paying much more attention to the policy making itself, and at some point to the process by which we choose those policy makers. And in that sort of moment where I began saying, hey, wait a minute here, this doesn't seem to be going right. Why aren't more people participating in our elections? Why aren't better people running for office? Why aren't we in the midst of the debate in policy-making arenas like Congress or the state legislature or city council, county boards? Why don't we have the quality of people and conversation and debate? And why isn't it more a debate among people who trust and respect each other and who have different views, trying to find a way to bring those views together? Why is it turned into this sort of shouting match and food fight like in the lunchroom in my little high school? We used to do that, actually. Some of you maybe never had a food fight, but do they have food lunch in school anymore? Because anyhow, in that process, somebody said to me, why don't you get more involved in where our democracy is going, the process by which we choose those policymakers? And I've been doing that for the last few years. And in that process, it's become clear to me that there's a notion that we have in our community that has separated out policy making and policy makers from those of us with the passion and the energy about the process. Every once in a while, they find a magical intersection. Senator Paul Wellstone is really a classic example, and certainly the person who inspired me to think about running for office. But when those intersections happen, we have a chance because it allows us to see a path forward and to pursue that. Congressman McGovern was in the movie. I don't know if you saw that, but those moments of intersection now, I believe we're at a time where they are more apparent and more possible and more visible for us, and we need to grab hold of them. Why do we need to grab a hold of them? Because, this is our state, this is our nation, this is our world, and we're it. That's the bad part about getting older is you look around and you go, wait a minute, we're it. The nice thing is that there's 100 more people here today than last year. The other nice thing is that we're in the middle of a real debate. Another nice thing is that we had some big challenges last year in the election, and people got involved. It was almost like we had forgotten that organizing was at the base of our political work. But somehow those constitutional amendments really kind of cranked up people. A million phone calls got made and all of that. We have been reminded about the seriousness of inaction and not paying attention. We've been reminded that when we come together and do just the basic organizing work, we can make a difference. And we've been reminded that while we do need to pay attention to our own state, we also got to kind of pay attention to Washington and the rest of the world at the same time. And okay, those are big jobs, but we can do it. But maybe more importantly, we've been reminded that it's just us. And today's themes and the threads of values that have gone through the conference so far about collaboration and coming together really speak to what's possible. That's what it's taken at every step of our nation to move forward. I'm always honored and occasionally a little un-Minnesotan about the fact that we're the top voting state in the nation. It's kind of cool. We're like 5% ahead. Yeah. And, well, of course we should be, but it's 5% ahead of the number 2 state, or occasionally 6%, which happens to be Wisconsin, but really, who cares, right? But I also know it's an average. And in our state, we have to be very cautious about a couple things. One is not resting on our laurels. We're number 1 in cooperatives and number 1 in volunteers, blah, blah, blah. So we got to be not complacent. But also, we have to know that averages, underneath them, there are probably disparities that are really serious matters. We have a great transportation system, but a big bridge went down in my neighborhood. I don't know if you noticed. Great education system, incredible disparities. Fabulous healthcare system. Some people have really good healthcare, some people don't. And when you take that approach on the question of our election turnout, and we have sort of European levels, one of the things you find that there are parts of our state that vote in the 90% range, like Duluth, and there are parts of our state, like where I live, that vote in the 50 and 60% range. And so I'm always trying to figure out what can we do to make our state even higher, but more importantly, what do we do to address disparities that are underneath those high averages? You could say most people in the country are well-fed, and you could say, and underneath that, 50 million people are in danger, and it endangers our whole future. But in that process, I'm often asking audiences, especially where it's very high vote, like, hey, how do you do it? Just looking for tips or ideas. And I was up in Red Lake, so some of you know where the Red Lake Nation is. Someday I hope our walleye comes from the Red Lake Nation. And there was a town hall meeting. It wasn't as big as this, but kind of like this. And I'm up in front, and I'm kind of making it up as I go. And I said, hey, how is it that your community here votes in the 90% range? Which is extraordinary. Where I live, we vote in the 50 or 60% range. And they said, well, actually, first, it was dead silent. And I don't know about you, but that's awkward. But, oh, my God, what did I say? But anyhow, after about an hour or 10 seconds or something, a young woman in the back corner stood up and pointed at me. And she said, when I drove into the town of Red Lake, so some of you have been there, you go through town, she said that I drove by this giant VFW hall, Veteran of Foreign War Hall, and she said, inside that hall is a very long list of all the braves, all the young men who've given their life for this country. And she pointed at the ground, she said, we love this beautiful place, we are very patriotic, and we vote. And she sat down, and the whole room nodded in unison, and that was kind of it. And so I took that into my heart, and I thought about it some, and then I ended up over in Hermantown, nearby, vote in the 90% range. And I'm at a Rotary luncheon, round tables, rubber chicken, the whole thing right here, right? And I'm sitting next to the head of the chamber. He's a Rotary president, head of the chamber, printer of some kind. And I just making small talk, I said, hey, you guys up here, you vote in the 90% range. Like, no city in the nation votes in the 90% range. I said, how do you do it? And he didn't blink. He just said, we are very patriotic, and we take care of the things that we love, and that includes voting. Just like that. And I thought, wait a minute. Here's the head of the Chamber of Commerce over in Hermantown, using the same words and the same concept as this young Native American woman in Red Lake, which is that we as a people love this place. But we don't just sort of say, hey, we love America, we love Minnesota. We express our love when we and by the act of taking care of this place. And then that includes voting, because voting is how we pick the people who then pick themselves or, among others, set the policies. And I kind of feel like that's the value that we have to tap as we try to broaden this into a much bigger community. There are people in our state who can be our allies because they also love this place like we do. And they also don't just think that should be rhetoric, they think that should be taking care of this place. I spent a lot of time with people in our Army and National Guard and in the military service. There's 400,000 veterans' families. There's thousands in our military. They care about food access, obesity, malnourishment, like others you would not imagine. They are an incredible ally that is there to be tapped. We have our entrepreneurs and the people in the state who are trying to find their way, because that's where employment is really coming from. Yes, there are jobs being created in some places, but people in this state create their own jobs. 60,000 people every year come through my office creating their own jobs, creating their own companies. Those people have a stake, not only from themselves, but for the whole community. Of course, our churches, but also the people who share our values about this state. All of them are potential partners as we expand this out. Some other communities actually know more about policy making. They have been through and have experienced and have built infrastructures for policy lobbying. Church community comes to mind, incredibly important in the last couple years of the work that's gone on. We as a people have the opportunity to take what we know, and this is a select body and in a way kind of a privileged body, but to take what we know, to take the history of our nation and the futures that's possible, and to weave it together with the issues, the concerns, and the beliefs of other people. Powered by the stories that we saw, and the stories in the movie, and the stories that you see, some of you, every single day, we can tell a story that brings other people into the process. Which policies and exactly the order and how we rank them, that'll get sorted out. And in fact, this is one of the best policy climates we've had in years. And also, the economy is better, which really does change the mood and changes a whole lot of other things. But we have a chance to do it. And the thing that was the most powerful for me in my work about food and agriculture and hunger, and I work both in this country and overseas, is that it had the element of trying to make sure that we were sustaining the planet, the water, the soil, for those times we shall never see, for those grandkids and great-grandkids and whoever is out there. And that's something that I think is nourishing of the soul to invest for a future we won't see. But it also has the real urgency of addressing those issues for right now, for those kids and parents and everyone who are hungry and malnourished right this minute. We need to take the power of the future and the power of the now and put it into change, because we love this place. Thank you very much.
Brown rice and that broccoli. I can't get enough of that brown rice and that broccoli. Pour that vegan cheese on that brown rice and that broccoli. Our favorite snack to eat is brown rice and that broccoli.
Fresh
food, eat cool. Fresh food, eat cool. Brown rice and that broccoli. Brown rice and that broccoli. Our favorite snack to eat is brown rice and that broccoli.
Got some old pork skins, gonna make a snack when I mix that in with some old petroleum, like what you get from the gas station. Sell that to the children, tell them eat it when they chillin', but I bet that it will be cold when they find out they ate chitlin'. You won't believe what I just caught, cause this some hardcore food for thought, but it ain't fast food giving blood clots, cause this right here is good for your heart. DC, what I'm trying to mean, don't eat like a joker, eat like a king, or if you female, eat like a queen. Superman, Wonder Woman, brown rice, broccoli.
Everybody talking about them hot Cheetos and chocolates. I don't really like them, screaming brown rice and that broccoli. Brown rice and that broccoli. Brown rice and that broccoli. They don't want to know what's in them hot Cheetos and chocolates. If you know the song called Hot Cheetos and Takis, this the remix, we rapping brown rice and that broccoli. 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 I can't get enough of that brown rice and that broccoli. Pour that vegan cheese on that brown rice and that broccoli. Our favorite snack to eat is brown rice and that broccoli.
Fresh
food, eat cool. Fresh food, eat cool. Brown rice and that broccoli. Brown rice and that broccoli. Our brown rice and that broccoli. You say Cheetos and Takis is your favorite snack. The sugar in it is a molecule away from crack. Traces yellow 5 cause chronic diarrhea. Do you want anything swollen or bleeding rectum rim? Oh, you want some Takis? Well, let's look at the ingredients. Artificial spices plus a couple different types of acids. Tell you about that MSG and why it's bad for you and me. Causing vomiting, hyperactivity. I mean, honestly, it's aggravating, but not speaking metaphorically. I'm talking literally. Add it on to 88. So what you wanna eat? So what you gonna eat? So what you wanna eat? Brown rice and that broccoli. Brown rice and that broccoli. I can't get enough of that brown rice and that broccoli. Pour that vegan cheese on that brown rice and that broccoli. Our favorite snack to eat is brown rice and that broccoli.
Fresh.
Food, eat, cool. Fresh, food, eat, cool. Brown rice and that broccoli. Brown rice and that broccoli. Our favorite snack to eat is brown rice and that broccoli.
Let me flip the script though, let's go dip into the stove. Skipping with some food stamps and hop out with some greens at home. Fix those greens and now they're gold. If you want they can be sold. Just don't mix them up with them Takis and them hot Cheetos. Red eyes before my eyes and that hue just intensifies. The irony is that I don't eat those and I still spit fire. You don't need that, you need this. Like a crackhead needs some resist. Our stomachs are impoverished. This stuff right here's oasis.
Descended cornmeal, carmine monotrate, maltodextria sugar, maltosodium glutamate, weight 40 lake, yellow 6 lake, yellow 6, yellow 5, hydrogenated oil, corn syrup, sodium decadenate, disodium phosphate, sodium caseinate, disodium mosylate, disodium corn, palm oil.
What's up? This your man DJ K for Motivation. You just got done watching that brown rice and broccoli, straight up, locally grown, fresh, organic youth hip hop right there. Alright? That's sustainable music right there. Do the knowledge, educate yourself, know what you put in your body, and this is pretty much how it's gonna go down for the rest of your life. Better eat healthy, get that holistic health going, alright? It's DJ K for Motivation. I approve this video.